everyone. Thanks for joining. Well, my name is Lauren Calise. I'm the Director of Sales for GB Group. Thank you, everybody, for joining our webinar. This is being recorded currently and will be reposted on a YouTube channel. So we'll get that link out to everyone who is attending. A few housekeeping. We've activated the question and answer forum. The chat is not activated, but you can put anything in the question and answer. We'll review most of the questions throughout the presentation will be answered, but we'll do question and answering afterwards, after the presentation. If you have anything you want to just add in, go ahead and feel free and people can chime in there. Go ahead and take it away, panelists.
Hi, my name is, we're here today to talk about helpful tips and hints for SB 326. And we're going to just start with an introduction of everybody. My name's Becky Larson, and I'm with Life Specialty Coatings. And I've been talking on 326 ever since it became code. And Life Specialty Coatings manufactures all different types of coatings, from waterproofing coatings, so that's why we're very interested in this bill, as well as pool decks and any kind of coating you can think of, wall coatings, you name it, we manufacture it. So we're here just to tell you a little bit about the presentation and a little bit more. Hopefully you guys will learn something that helps you make your inspections go a little bit smoother and easier. Russell?
Hi, everyone. My name is Russell Brown. I'm one of the owners and operators of GB Group Construction and Painting. We've been in business about 30 years, specializing in reconstruction projects for multifamily HOAs and apartments. One of our core competencies is we also do forensic investigations for existing structures. And we've been doing this a long time. So the SB 326 bill was right up our alley. And kind of like Becky from the get-go, we did try to take an industry-leading educational position. So hopefully you have some good takeaways from our presentation today and get all your questions answered.
I'm Mike Kennedy. I'm a partner with Berding Weil. I've personally been involved in construction defect claims for about 25 years. We're the largest HOA law firm in California. We're also in Hawaii, partnership as well in construction defect claims.
Mike, you have a little bit of a delay, just FYI.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So I think we can, it's okay.
Yeah.
I think we can skip this one. We just introduced ourselves, which is just a little bit about us, pretty much what we said. Just quickly, what we're going to go over today is we're going to do a quick overview of the bill, just touch on the highlights of it, talk about why you should not wait, what to look for in an inspector, as well as what affects the inspection price. We're going to go over what should be in the report that you receive, how to get a good contractor, and then we're going to touch briefly on inspection vets.
So if you're not a contractor or an attorney, digesting the 326 bill can be a little confusing. So I want to go over what are some of the, the who, what, when, where's portion of this bill to help summarize it. There's also some key terms in here that some of you may have never seen before. I know I had never seen EEE before, which is mainly what a lot of this bill is about. So this bill started January 1st of 2020. So it's been going for a little while now. And the expectation is that your inspections need to be compliant and complete by January 1st, 2025. The people allowed to conduct these inspections are going to be structural engineers and architects. You'll notice this is one of the things that differs from the apartment bill 721, where general contractors are actually able to be the inspecting agent. Mike will cover a little bit of the intent of this bill, but one key thing to remember regarding this is that your inspecting agent is different than your opening and closing agent. So your contractor really has no role other than opening and closing locations for the inspector. So what is an EEE? These are going to be things that are wood framed and above 6 feet that are intended for life use. And what the goal of the bill is to inspect those elements as well as their associated components to make sure that they're in a functioning manner and performing safely with an expected lifespan that doesn't trigger any emergency repair work. Given that, we'll go into a little more information about these components in a slide coming up. But Mike, do you want to touch on some of the intent of the bill?
Yeah, the idea is to capture anything that may eventually present a life safety issue and fall off the building, essentially, even if it hasn't deteriorated to that point yet. This all came about after a tragedy in Berkeley a few years ago where a balcony fell off an apartment building and 6 college students were killed. And that building was only 4 years old at that time.
Right.
So this inspection regimen is to check for life safety and also to update the reserve study. This is ultimately part of the reserve study update inspection process. And I think using the term EEE is helpful because it's commonly known as the balcony bill or the balcony inspection bill, but it's not just balconies.
Right. There are a lot of components that qualify as an EEE, such as a staircase, a walkway, a catwalk, some breezeways, obviously balconies and other sorts of structures that are protruding from the building. Those are all what the law intended to capture to make sure that HOAs, and particularly with this bill, that folks are being proactive instead of reactive.
Yeah.
Right. If you want to go to the next slide, we can just what Russell was saying, we can point out some of the things that this is just a picture with some of the examples of what needs to be inspected, what an EEE is, the flashings at the door, the wood posts, flashing and waterproofing, the supports, anything that's going to be wood structure that somebody might lean up against or fall through, the railings on the landing, the stair connectors on the stairs, long walkways, just like Russell was saying, a catwalk, anything that is wood based and above 6 feet needs to be inspected. Also to say with 326, it has to be 3 or more units attached. So if it's single family home or duplex, that does not fall underneath the code. It has to be 3 or more units attached for that. Do you guys have anything to add? Did I miss any?
No, you're right. And it's, a lot of people don't realize it includes all of the associated waterproofing elements. So it's not just looking at the joists from underneath. And that's why the posts and railings are important. So if you look at this picture here, that center post from the roof coming down to the middle of that deck penetrates the waterproofing at the deck level. That's probably a square 4x4 inch wood post, which isn't supporting the deck, but where it's connected to the deck is a penetration through the waterproofing. And that's a very common source of water intrusion into the system that we see in our construction defect claims.
Yeah, the associated waterproofing is obviously the first barrier for water intrusion. And often with decay, it's typically not just associated with age, but typically with some sort of source of water intrusion. So your inspector is going to be verifying that these associated waterproofing elements are going to be performing in a functioning manner and that they pose no long-term damage. So even if it's not just a life safety issue, if they're seeing maybe some systematic failures throughout the complex, or they're seeing some maybe future concerns that aren't an immediate threat now, but maybe something you need to begin preparing for down the road, that's something that's going to be stated in the report with the useful life expectancy. So we always get the question, right? Exactly. One of the facets of this law is the 95% confidence. And that's a really complicated way of making sure that these inspectors are fully satisfied with what they've discovered and are truly turning over every stone to make sure that they're certifying accurately. So visual inspections is a part of the inspection, but it's not the whole inspection. The reason why is because a visual inspection does not tell the whole story. So if you have a proposal in front of you that's visual inspection only, the chances are it's not going to be a full encompassing proposal. Here's a great project that GB Group worked on. As you can see, very clean paint job, no real stucco anomalies showing any sorts of trouble. And if you'll go ahead and click to the next slide, you can see here that it was pretty much held up by the toothpicks. Long-term water damage was taking place at this location. But without destructive testing, this would have never been identified. So visual inspections are necessary, but also a lot of the time destructive testing, which is opening certain locations that your inspectors cannot see, is going to be necessary as well. So in order to get that 95% confidence, they need to be accessing all of those elements that the law states, like the associated waterproofing and the conditions of the framing, which is going to entail destructive testing.
Exactly. I've seen it over and over. You're going to get proposals that say the statute says it's a visual inspection. We can just look at the balcony and see whether it's okay. And these photos, and we have tons of photos in our files from our construction defect cases that are very similar, where the stucco looks fine and the lightweight concrete on the deck looks fine, but that's just the skin, and we got to inspect the bones of the project, which is the wood framing. And so it's a visual inspection of the framing, not a visual inspection of the balcony. And so your boards will be very tempted when they get those proposals that are really cheap because they just walk around and look at the balconies, but that doesn't comply. That's not what's required, and it's not going to find the damage because you got to look at the framing itself, not just the stucco on the outside, which is waterproof but not structural.
And just as a closing comment, the intent of the bill was not to go carve up the complex, try to look for problems. They want to make sure that we are not taking or cutting any corners in terms of certifying if something is safe. And unfortunately, the reality is we do have some great technologies like borescopes and puck vents that allow us to see some of the story, but ultimately the professionals will almost all agree that some sort of destructive testing is going to be needed to be fully compliant.
Russell, can you?
I've seen some bids where it comes through and it's just a visual inspection, and I've told the person who's received the bid, the owner or the manager, you should ask what happens if you have to make a hole, if you have to do destructive testing. And the price went up to $750 to $1,000 per deck. And that's where you pick that cheap person, and then they're going to give you change orders because they're most likely they're going to need to take a look, and they're just trying to come in as a cheap one. And we also have a question here that asks, what is destructive testing? Russell, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Destructive testing is, in summary, requiring contractors to open physically the exterior envelope of a component to see the underlying circumstances. If you go ahead and click to the next page, this would be a great slide to cover that on. Here is a entry to a patio door where there's some concrete cracking, but the destructive testing, which would be the opening of this location. As you can see, the concrete is no longer there on the photo on the right. Not much is there, as you can see. With that said, you wouldn't have been able to see that there was a real life safety issue or some real decay potentially causing a life safety issue without opening it. So the destructive testing is by the contractor. It's not by your architect or engineer. It's to open these things so that they can see the conditions and performance of these items.
Yeah, it's kind of a cruel irony that the components that are most vulnerable to deterioration from water intrusion are the structural elements, right? And the stucco and the concrete isn't structural at all. It protects the wood from water theoretically and from ultraviolet light and stuff, but the stucco might look just fine and the structural wood is all rotted behind it. So you've got to cut it open to see what's going on.
Very true. So the next topic up is, what's the hurry? So many people are waiting and waiting, and they think that when it gets closer, they're going to do their inspections, but it's just not recommended to wait. Your prices are going to go up for everything. We've already talked to so many inspectors, and there's not enough inspectors to inspect all the balconies that need to be inspected before 2025. So if you wait till the end, that price is going to be higher because they're just not going to be available. The price for labor and materials is increasing daily right now. That's going to get worse as well as we go. You're just going to see everything's going to go higher and higher. If you decide to get your inspections now, you have the possibility of phasing those inspections out. So if it's a hardship on the community, then you can do some this year, some next year, phase out the repairs. You just have many different options that can happen. And if you do it, wait to the last minute, all your options are gone and these reports need to go in. And what if there's this life safety issue and you wait to the last minute? You just don't get that extra time or thought process to be able to move forward and pick the right person to do the repairs. Michael, do you want to touch on the Fannie Mae?
Yeah. There's a new, so Fannie Mae in their lending guidelines is always changing their criteria and the questionnaires for condominium projects. And they just changed them again in January. And one of the architect or engineer. And, you know, if you think about it, most projects have never been inspected by an architect or engineer since they were completed, unless they've been through an SB 800 case, or they've done their SB 326 inspections, because the inspection has to be done by an architect or engineer. So we're thinking as this goes forward, as this deadline approaches and passes, that's going to get even more stringent, because now there is a reason that you should have been inspected by an architect where there wasn't before. And it's probably also going to affect insurance renewals. You know, as the association renews the general liability policies, part of the renewal is going to be, okay, give us your most recent SB 326 inspection, because we want to make sure the balconies aren't about to fall off. So those are the mechanisms to, you know, pressure HOAs or the consequences HOAs are looking at if they don't undertake these inspections. And the sooner you do it, the better. I mean, if the wood framing is deteriorating from water intrusion, the good contractors and inspectors going to be busy and not available as that deadline approaches, as you know, the framing gets more and more run. So the cost to repair just goes up and up, and the costs go up and up, and the availability of the good contractors and inspectors goes down. So those are all good reasons to do it as early as possible, at least start the process as early as possible.
In a normal economy, we see between 3 to 5% annual increases for cost of construction. And that's it. We haven't had a standard economy in quite a while, given COVID and the supply chain and what have you. But during these times, we've actually seen closer to 10 to 20% changes in construction costs internally. So when we're looking at doing it in 2022 versus 23 and 24, we could be talking about a spread here of, you know, 30, 40% for the people that really wait till the end of the requirement. So it is one of those things, times is of the essence. And touching from a construction standpoint, what Michael was referring to, every time a summer and a winter passes, you know, these EEEs are experiencing, you know, a life expectancy death. And they're going to be shrinking, cracking, moving. And what once was maybe a small leak has now been leaking for 3 years. And what was going to be a small repair has now turned into a full rebuild. So we have a lot of clients and apartment ownership groups that are beginning to try to build a plan to address their large scale portfolios. And unfortunately, there are HOAs that are not in a financial position to be able to address this right now. And we'll talk about that later down the road. But one of the things that you need to remind your boards of is that with the annual increases in construction, sometimes waiting is not the better solution.
And with 721, there is actually a monetary fee if you don't get your reports done on time. For not getting the reports turned in. With 326, there's not a monetary fee for that.
I could definitely see insurance requirements beginning to request these sorts of documents for these HOAs and apartment groups.
Agree.
And so it's not a matter of if, it's probably when, given that this is such a thorough inspection. It's a hell of a lot stronger than a termite inspection on a unit. So so this very much so will come into play.
I agree that 721, the apartment version, which is a bit different, 721 has
Michael, we're experiencing
enforcement wise and some pretty tight deadlines. Oh, sorry, I have technical difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Am I back?
You're frozen.
How about now?
There you go.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Am I back now? Okay, sorry. For the apartment version, 721 has some pretty tight deadlines and some teeth in the enforcement. So it's a little bit different and more stringent even than this version. But even this version, it's going to be some pretty severe consequences for those associations that don't get this done and get it done early.
Great.
So what are some things to consider when you're reviewing your portfolio about how you should financially prepare for this, and what is the best timing for your associations? One of the things you can ask yourself is, what kind of shape is my community in? I'm sure we have a lot of property managers on here. We can ask you, what's your worst community in your portfolio in terms of construction statuses right now, and everyone could come up with their property. And some of these associations have lots of EEEs that need to be inspected, and some have relatively none. So when you're thinking about, which association is going to have the financial impact, you're definitely going to want to think about the sizes of the community, the complexity of the community, the current status of the community. Those are all things that need to be answered. And we always recommend that you should work hand in hand with your reserve study analyst on this, even before you get your bids. You're going to want to have a really good grip on what's upcoming in your association or your apartment groups, given that if there is a reconstruction project on the horizon, the law actually does allow you to document new construction and repairs to be a part of the certifiable report. So there are associations that we've been able to save, well over $100,000 that have current reconstruction projects in place that we are just now adding a 326 inspection element to the project. And what that's doing is it's allowing to not have to double dip. One of the most painful things we see is when we have to cut open new projects or newly finished work. It makes everybody look bad. It makes the contractors look bad. It makes the association look bad, that there's bad planning. So always get ahead of this thing with your reserve analysts and your boards to make sure that you're prepared for each individual association's needs. There's also some funny photos in here. If you have a community that you have habitual offenders that are going to have a lot of plants on decks and a lot of people doing things they're not supposed to, you may want to prioritize those a little sooner than later, given that they probably have more defect issues. Michael, do you want to talk about some of the other aspects?
Yeah, I think the costs are going to be all over the map, and you can save up for these inspections via the reserve study. The inspection itself can be a reserve study line item and should be, but when your boards are considering how much to contribute to the reserve study for the inspections, have the contractor come out early, even if you're not doing the inspection yet, because the costs are going to be everywhere. Are your decks open from below so you can see the framing? Is it a piece of siding up there that the contractor can just pull down and look at? Or is it stucco we got to cut through? How are we going to access those? Is it 4 stories high and we got to have a lift? Is there a narrow pathway and a hillside right there? We can't drive the lift back there. So now we got to have scaffolding put up. Access and the type of construction are really going to vary from association to association. And so don't just use a placeholder number when you're doing your annual budget and considering the reserve contribution. Get the contractor's input early so that the number you're saving up for is accurate.
Right.
So when inspections are done a couple of years down the road, if they want to wait, you've saved up enough money. You don't want to just assume some placeholder number and find out that your number is way too high or way too low.
Right.
Another thing to consider too, if you know that your balconies are in bad shape, you look at them, there's water damage, there's wood rot, they're falling off the building. You should have a contractor come out and do the repairs before you get that inspection. And then the inspector can come in while the repairs are going on. The balconies are open. They can give you that report. It's going to cost less. You don't end up with that report on your records for 18 years. So that's also really helpful. And Russell can help you guys with that too. So that's excellent.
Yeah, that's huge. That report, like Becky mentioned, is an association record for 18 years. So every prospective purchaser is going to get a copy of that report for the next 18 years, and that's going to affect the property values. And so the way to avoid surprises and the way to avoid the effect on the property values like that, I think, is you can look at just a couple of the balconies before it's your official 326 report. Have GB Group or a contractor come out and open 2 or 3 balconies, and let's see what we're going to find when we do the official report. And if the project is under 10 years old, we can go make the builder pay for the rest of the inspections and the repairs. Or even if the project is older, you've got time to raise the money by a special assessment or a loan, do the repairs, then have the report done after the repairs are done or as they're done. And you know the report's going to say everything's fine because you just did the repairs. And that will be the association record and the baseline for future inspections. And you can preserve property values and control the process a little bit better, because you don't want to just launch into this inspection and have the report, have no idea what it's going to say. And now it's a surprise and everybody's stuck with it for the next 18 years and it triggers all these deadlines. And there's just a lot of consequences to that.
Very true. So what to look for in an inspector? They have to be a licensed architect or structural engineer, and make sure they are a structural engineer, not a civil engineer. Ask for those licenses and ask who's going to be doing the inspections. So you know that John Smith is the person that's out there and you've seen his license. You don't see John Smith's license and then have somebody else come out and do the work in the inspections. Make sure they are experienced in giving forensic inspections. Get industry references and check those references. Make sure they have the correct insurance for working with an HOA or apartment complex. That's a big deal because a lot of people will come out and do work and they do not have the correct insurance to be able to do that work. They should have the correct tools if they need a borescope. Some of the silly things that I've seen people come out and they don't even have ladders. They're going to need a ladder. Might need moisture detectors. There's different things that they should have. So make sure that they have those correct tools and the knowledge to come out. I always recommend that you ask for a sample of the inspection report that they give out. So you make sure it's something that's thorough. You've got pictures that they're calling out where any problems are. Take a look at that. Make sure that's exactly what you want and that it's thorough and yet not too thorough enough, meaning I had somebody the other day say that they had an 800-page inspection report. Well, who's going to read an 800-page inspection report? I'm not. So you want to make sure that it's good enough. You can hand that to a contractor, but that it's not overkill.
I want to add something to that. When you're looking for an inspector, we highly recommend that you interview them on their capabilities and their record, if you will. But more importantly, you want to go with someone you're comfortable with. This is not the proposal that you want to shortchange yourself and just go with always the low bid. Although low bid may be the answer, you're going to want to actually dive into these proposals and really understand what is fully entailed in the proposal. For example, there are some inspections that I've seen that is just the charge for the visual. And they say, hey, we got the visual inspection. Where's our report? And they go, oh, no, here's our cost to do the destructive testing with the contractor. And you picked these guys intending that they had the low price when really it was not a fully complete proposal. So when you are vetting your proposals, remember, there's going to be 2 separate ones. You're going to have your inspecting agent and you're going to have your contractor that's going to be doing your opening and closing. There are a few entities that can do both. I believe the intent of the law was to separate those two to allow the inspecting agent to not be associated with the repairing agent to help control that aspect. So we're actually going to talk about that here a little bit on the next slide here, if you want to go ahead and switch to that one.
There's a couple of things I want to chime in on this.
Oh, yeah, please.
Slide first off, if I can, the law says you can use an architect or a structural engineer. I recommend architect because we're not just looking at the structural framing members of the EEEs. We've got to look at the waterproofing, the flashings, the membranes, the penetrations where the railings are bolted into the building. We've got to look at all the sources of water intrusion, not just the structural integrity of the framing. And that's an architect's specialty. That's not an engineer specialty. The engineer can assess the framing members, but not the performance of all the waterproofing and flashing and associated systems. So I think architects. And the experience in forensic inspection, both for the architect and the contractor, are huge. How do you find them? Well, the shortcut is, this is exactly the type of investigation we've been doing in construction defect cases for years and years and years. The destructive testing, the report that's generated, the recommendations that are made. This is what we're already doing in construction defect cases. So the same people that serve as our consultants and expert witness are the inspectors to have there. And the contractor, although it doesn't say it in the law itself, should also be experienced in forensic inspections, not just any contractor with a Class B license. It should be somebody who's experienced in doing these destructive testings, because this is an inhabited in-service building. People live there. So it's going to be intrusive getting access, cutting open somebody's balcony while they're there and home or not home, or they just had a baby or whatever, arranging all that and then patching it all back and making sure the paint matches and it wouldn't break somebody's, barbecue in their balcony or whatever. Dealing with all that is very complicated. And the good contractors who do the destructive testing over and over again for these inspections and in construction defect inspections have lots of good experience dealing with all that stuff. It's very different than new ground up construction, even though it's the same license.
Yeah, you definitely want to go with someone with high integrity. This is the way the bill is structured, is it does leave a lot of room to interpret what should be considered a priority 1 or a priority 2. So make sure, like I said, who you partner with on these things. You want to make sure that you either have a track record with or they can prove their track record. I always tell associations that we do these presentations for, that even if your association has no findings, no immediate threats or any issues, we still close that loop as an integrity part of it, because these things are not meant to be blow and go. They are meant to identify life safety and set HOAs up with a proactive plan to get on track to address these things, so that you don't end up on the news, if you will.
True.
And it's stuff. So, and update your reserve study too. And if the report is everything is fine, you don't have to increase your reserve contribution. That's good news, but make sure it's reliable information.
Right.
Right. And just to note that we talk about 326 needing a licensed architect or structural engineer, just the two are the options. With 721, you can use either one of those. There's also a civil engineer that can do the work, the inspections, or a contractor that's been in business for 5 years. So they have a couple different, with 721, a couple different types of inspectors that can do the work, just as a side note.
Yeah. Apartment ownership, typically there are sophisticated apartment ownership have relationships with good general contractors that do these types of repairs, and the contractor can do the inspection and the report and the repair. But again, everything I said before about making sure it's a reliable, experienced contractor for this type of building goes for apartments as well.
So we get the question a lot, why can't you just give us a price per unit or a price per balcony? And the reality is that there are way too many factors to account for that to give a fixed price. Things such as access and what the EEE is comprised of, or the design, are all going to dictate different levels of inspection that are going to be needed. We've done SB 326 inspections that have, some 30 balconies hanging off over a cliff. I'm pretty sure you can't charge $50 a deck to inspect those units. So make sure that when you're reviewing these proposals, that access is accounted for. And frankly, if it's not, you probably shouldn't be working with those folks, because it sounds like a kind of a backdoor thing to get into the property. But make sure you're working with someone who's thought this through and that it's stated in the proposal. Also, given the price, it goes back to the timing of things. Are you preparing your budget with for 2024 with a number from 2022? That's not going to work. That's going to affect the price that you're budgeting for. Again, construction costs in this economy are scaling almost 15 to 20% And in a standard, it's a lot more modest at, 3 to 5-ish or so. So getting the inspection price accurate, you're going to really want to interview these folks and make sure you understand what their approach is, because you can have an architect and a contractor as one proposal, and an engineer and a contractor as your other proposal, and they can be $50,000 apart. And I've seen a lot larger number than that. And it typically, the price is derived from what the inspector is deeming is needed to get to that 95% confidence. So there are folks that are saying, hey, we're going to visually
that's a huge thing.
Yeah, Mike, do you want to talk about how they work with the statisticians in litigation as well as SB 326?
Yeah, there's a lot of confusion about this, and this is really something that's going to affect the price, because how many locations are we cutting open? Well, the bill says, the statute says, the inspector opens as many as they need to be 95% sure that what they saw is representative of the whole. So some inspectors say, I want to look at 100% of locations. Some inspectors will say it depends on how big the project is. So if you think about it, if you have a building with 4 balconies, they may want to look at 3 of them. But if you have 400 balconies, they may only need to look at 20% of them or something. So it's up to the inspector. And I think that the inspector should be the one that decides. What you don't want is the manager or the board telling the inspector how many to look at, because you got to think from a risk management standpoint. What if you're wrong? What if the inspector wants to look at 50% and the board says, well, we hired our own statistician and you only have to look at 20%, and then one that they didn't look at falls off the building and somebody's hurt, right? The deciding how many to look at is a big responsibility that carries with a lot of risk with it. And I always recommend to boards, don't take on responsibilities you don't have under the governing documents or the civil code or the corporations code, because every new responsibility comes with risk and potential liability. And if somebody's wrong and we miss something and a balcony falls off, or it's all rotted when we open it up, 9 years later, you don't want to be the one that decided not to look at it.
Very true. What should be in the inspection report is our next slide. Basically, you're going to want to see a list of components inspected, a physical condition of each one of these components, as well as the remaining useful life, so that can be put into the reserve studies. Make sure that is sent over to them, and also pictures. I always want to see pictures. It doesn't say you have to have pictures, but it's great to have a picture of the balcony and then have a circle on that picture that says this is where the problem is. This is what should be done. Recommendations for the repairs, if needed, need to be in that report. And then, like we said before, that report's going to be added to reserve studies for 18 years. Mike, I think you have some more you want to add to this slide.
Yeah, right? That remaining useful life of the components is hopefully the most important part, because if your reserve study has that we've got to rebuild the walkways of the balconies in 20 years, you do this inspection and you find out that no, they're in better condition than we thought, and we can push it out to 25 years or 30 years, or they're in worse condition than we thought and we got to redo it in 10 years. That's really the purpose of this, is to update your reserve study. But it may be that repairing or rebuilding the balconies and walkways isn't in your reserve study. Keep in mind, the reserve study is for components that you have to address in the next 30 years. So if the project was new and you don't anticipate having to rebuild the balconies and walkways for 50 years, it wouldn't have been in the reserve study at the beginning, because it only looks 30 years in the future, not forever in the future. And so you've got things that get closer as the building ages that are a new line item in the reserve study. And so that remaining useful life tells us how long we have to save up to rebuild the balconies, even if they're mostly okay right now. So that's really, really important. And then the fact that it's association record that anybody can get a copy of is another important thing. I touched on that earlier, but keep in mind, when a unit sells, the association's obligation is to provide association records to the member, which is going to be the seller. And the seller is going to provide that to the buyer, and the buyer is going to look at it. And if the report says that the balconies are all in terrible condition, they're going to use that to try to negotiate the price downward, and that's how it affects the property value. And the sellers are going to be stuck saying, yeah, I know the report's really scary, but we fixed it, I swear. We just don't have the updated report yet. That's a tough explanation to make. It's still going to affect the property values. And that's why it's much better to do this sort of dip your toe in the water. Let's look at a few balconies. It's not our official report yet. It can be an attorney-client privilege executive session topic, especially if it's under 10 years old, and we help coordinate those inspections and maybe help carry the costs so we can go get the costs back from the builder of the inspections. And that's just a way to let the board and the inspectors privately share the information, because it's not the official report yet, before we have the full-blown official report, of all the balconies, because if that report's a surprise, there are a lot of consequences to that we want to think about ahead of time.
So we actually have a really good question up here that I think Mike and Russell can address. What if our association just completed a deck project? Is there a way to become compliant without destructive testing? We've talked about this when we were getting ready for this, and you guys both had some great answers.
Yeah, I think if it was overseen by an architect, and the architect documented the work as it was done and is willing to write and stamp a report, because remember, when they stamp the report, they're putting their license on the line that it's accurate. If it was recent enough and an architect was involved enough that they can write a report based on what was already done, then yes, they can do a report. What we typically do in an SB 800 construction defect case is, because we stay involved through the post-settlement repairs, and have the report generated during the repairs, because we have all the balconies open anyway. So it doesn't really cost anything extra to have this report done. Russell, I think you guys do that on any reconstruction project. As long as it's open, document it as you go, and now you don't have to reopen it again.
Absolutely. Right? Almost all of our reconstruction projects of any large scale right now, we are implementing SB 326 to help achieve that. Also, just as a good practice, contractors should be taking photos of their work in progress. Just about any project we have, we typically have some sort of photo database that hopefully can be given to what Mike was referring to, the architect or CM might have photos to be able to help reduce destructive testing. I can't imagine there are a ton of folks out there that were completely not involved with the project that would be willing to sign off on stuff without seeing some stuff in person. So for that matter, I would probably suggest speaking with a few architects and compiling the documents that you have from your contractor to see if there's enough there to substantially reduce the inspection or report cost.
Yeah, if the architect wasn't really involved in the recent project, or says, well, I wasn't there often enough and I wouldn't be comfortable stamping a report because I wasn't there and didn't see it with my own eyes, then it may not work. It all depends on how involved the architect was during the recent project and whether they can stamp the report.
So what if repairs are needed? So one of the things and facets of this law that should be discussed is that the law does give authorization, if needed, to the architect to instruct the contractor to open up or immediately address something that could be life safety. For example, if we're in the process of an SB 326 inspection and we find a source of water intrusion, it is up to us working with the inspector to make sure that we've identified correctly what's going on. And typically not much additional investigation is needed. We've done probably over 70 of these by now, and we pretty much rarely have had to additionally chase, we call it. But we do run into life safety issues. And that's pretty much the only reason your contractor's price for SB 326 should change is, for example, we conduct an opening and there's an immediate life safety issue that cannot be remedied immediately. So typically the process with that is your point of contact, your inspector would then reach out to property management and or the board, express the situation and prepare them to approve a emergency change order to make safe or sure the EEE in question. This is relatively common in some associations, but this gets back to the pre-planning. Is can you get ahead of this thing and not trigger all these mandated timelines that put a lot of stress on the community, its members, its management, etc. So there is ways that you can properly plan for this to be financially ready to go, and from a process standpoint. So always remember, your contractor's price should relatively stay the same unless directed by the architect to chase more damage or to make a EEEC.
Yeah, and if there's no life safety issue, technically there's no deadline to start repairs in this bill. The apartment version, SB 721, there is. You have to apply for a permit within 120 days. But for condominiums, they don't have that deadline to allow the association time to raise funds if they have to through a special assessment or a loan. And that's go to a vote sometimes, and that can take a while. But it does say the association has to follow the inspector's recommendations. And if the board wants to wait because they don't want to raise assessments and they don't want their neighbors to get mad at them and they're going to get off the board next year anyway, and they want to stick their head in the sand and they think they want to wait for 5 years, well, the cost of repair is going to go up. So you might have a report in 2022 that says you do X, Y, Z, and here's the estimate. And when the board calls the contractor back in 2025 to say, okay, we finally want to undertake the project, that price isn't going to work anymore. So if the inspector recommends repairs, the association should go ahead and do those repairs because they're not going to get cheaper and the building's not going to heal itself. It's only going to get worse and worse the longer they delay.
Miraculous healing.
Yeah, sorry, it doesn't happen.
Dang.
Yeah.
A great interview question for your team that you're going to be working with is, what do you foresee we're going to encounter in our inspection process? And especially on the open relief design communities, you should be able to have a pretty good idea. You know, obviously we can't see through walls, but a lot of the components that need to be inspected are right there in front of you. And it's interesting to see how people answer that question, because the high integrity folk are going to tell you hopefully straight up how it is and what to prepare for. And the people that dance around the interview question, there's probably a reason why they're not telling you what's really happening. So just food for thought. That was a really great interview question I got once, was, what do you anticipate we're going to run into? And it's an open-ended question, but hopefully the folks that you're working with have done some pre-research, looked at recent work orders, met with management to understand what reconstruction work has taken place to help give the board a better education on what to expect.
That's another good reason to have a good experienced forensic inspector as well as the contractor, because just from construction defect cases, I can walk around a project I've never seen before and say, well, in another case, that feature, created a problem, or these kinds of things are usually potential leak sources, or we see a bunch of efflorescence coming out of the stucco on that balcony. So you can, if you're experienced in doing these investigations, you can kind of tell where the problems are likely to occur. And so that's just another reason to have a good experienced inspector and contractor.
This is not the one you use a handyman on.
No. Your brother-in-law that happens to remodel kitchens, that has an architect license.
He's got a General B though.
Yeah. Good for him.
If I had a nickel for every time we had to clean up a inspection for someone's brother that had the license, that assured the folk that they could get them compliant, and it just turns into a blank check. It happens. So just be really careful with who you align with.
Yeah, cleaning up the mess after the fact is always more expensive. Yeah.
We do have a question, and I think I can answer it, but I'd like feedback from you guys. It is, does a building inspector's inspection during repairs carry weight for SB 326? And the 326 has to be done by an architect, a licensed architect, or a structural engineer. So although the building inspector's inspection may be looked at by that architect and engineer, he cannot stamp that report or write the report or send that report in. Russell, Mike?
Yeah, for the apartment version, it can be a retired building inspector, but not an on-duty building inspector. And for the condominium Davis Sterling Act version, it has to be an architect or a structural engineer. So the building inspector's inspection doesn't count, and it rarely does. They're rarely as thorough as they need to be to find problems like this. Typically, the municipality's building inspector is ensuring the progress of the job to make sure that they really are moving through. The roof's on when they said the roof would be on, and the windows are in when they said the windows would be in. They're not looking to the level of detail that you would need to get a report like this.
And building inspectors carry no liability. So, I mean, we had a building inspector at a project that I was speaking with about 3 months ago that was a teacher a few months ago prior to that. And I'll just be clear that it wasn't a very thorough inspection by the inspector. Every city's different. You get different qualifications of people and different levels of care. So the actual building inspector from the city jurisdiction isn't going to be a resource to use as, hey, they said it's certified safe, or they signed off on the repairs that they were accurate. It needs to be the forensic architect or structural engineer.
Yeah, I mean, we've got 30 lawyers handling construction defect cases in our firm, and think about it, 100% of our clients have been inspected by building inspectors.
Great point.
And if they always caught all the problems, we wouldn't have jobs. They don't catch all this stuff.
And just as a reminder, something the size of a pinhole can create $30,000 worth of damage over the course of a year. It happens all the time. So they're not going to catch every little thing, but when you're paying someone to find if there's anything to be concerned about, that's when you're going to have a really thorough inspection that you can stand behind.
Yep.
True. And
Yep.
that goes right into our next slide, which is what to look for in a contractor. With the contractor, first of all, like Russell was saying earlier, picking a contractor that you already have a solid relationship with is the most important thing. You don't want somebody out at the back of their truck who doesn't have the right licenses, doesn't have the right references or the right tools or the right staff. Somebody that you've used in the past that you know has done a great job, or a colleague has used that said they did an amazing job and their communication was great. That's really going to hold a lot of weight right there. Make sure that they have specifications from the manufacturer. That helps the bids be apples to apples. Otherwise, you might get someone who's only going to do this much work and use this product way expensive, and someone's going to do more work and it's going to be less expensive, or less work and it's going to be less expensive. So making sure that those bids are apples to apples. So having that manufacturer spec will help. Licensed and insured, both, and that they're skilled in waterproofing repairs, that they're not somebody who paints fences. It's not, as Russell and Mike said, it's not your maintenance guy. They know what they're doing.
There's a lot of misinformation out there about this bill. Unfortunately, there's a lot of people who have interpreted it differently. So just make sure that you're checking in with your legal counsel if you have any questions regarding this kind of stuff. This is not the estimate that you want to be lackadaisical on.
Yeah, and again, just to hammer on the point of the experienced contractor, not only do most contractors have a multifamily exclusion in their liability insurance so that they're not insured for a project like this, the contractors that work on multifamily projects pay extra to have coverage for these kinds of projects. But just the experience of dealing with an inhabited building, inevitably, they're going to, be cutting into people's balconies and somebody just had a baby, or our grandma just moved in, or we're gone on vacation, or we live overseas, or now we're unhappy because the paint doesn't match, or there's just a million details dealing with the people living there to get this done with minimal disruption to their lives. And if the contractor's good and experienced, they handle all that stuff. And if not, then it falls in the lap of you, the manager, and you're pretty busy already and you don't need that. So there's just, from top to bottom, there are lots of reasons to have a good experienced contractor. And even though this bill is relatively new, again, this is exactly like the investigations we've been doing forever in construction defect cases. It's the same destructive testing, it's the same report, it's the same people. And the list of contractors who should be doing this is pretty short. but the good news is there are some really good ones. One of them's on your screen right now.
Appreciate that.
You know, you want an experienced contractor for this kind of work doing these cuts, even though the inspector is the big player as far as the requirements of the statute. The impact on you and the residents is going to be most felt by how good the contractor is. It's really critical.
Tenant occupied construction is a different animal. So just make sure they have a track record of happy clients. And, you know, it is 2022 now. We're almost halfway through. If they're probably just starting on doing 326 inspections, they're probably a little late to the game. So make sure you get some comparable bids to make sure that you've got a full educated decision.
Yep. Yeah.
So
I
go
was
ahead,
gonna
Becky.
say, I know we're running a little close on time, so I hopefully everybody's able to stay for a little bit longer. We only have 2 more slides to go. So probably another 5 or 10 minutes at the most, and hopefully everyone's able to stay on. Go ahead, Russell.
One of the big things that we talk about with folks is the inspection vents, and in particularly the puck vents. The puck vents are a solution. They're not a one size fits all for every community. So if you have a proposal just to drill a bunch of puck vents and that's your inspection, that's not going to be thorough enough to get you what you need. So the strip vents and puck vents are a great solution, though, for some instances. One of them is that they are going to substantially reduce the cost of the destructive testing 9 years and 18 years from now. If you have entry ports to be able to see into the bones of an EEE, it's going to allow the inspection process to take place at a much faster rate. Also, if it doesn't have an inspection vent or a fire rated vent, you're actually increasing the performance of the EEE. It's going to be allowed to breathe better. They have fire ratings, which helps with fire resistivity and overall drainage of the moisture from that EEE. So the inspection vents are a great solution. We've worked with a lot of communities that were adding them during the course of construction. We've had a lot of communities add them as part of the SB 326. So definitely check in with your contractors if you think that adding a soffit vent would be a good solution for your community. And that's pretty much all that needs to be said on this one.
Yeah.
But it's
Just
not
so
a
if you guys don't know
one
what
size.
a puck vent is, a puck vent is like just a circular, looks like a puck that goes up in there instead of the tray vents.
And I want to touch on the puck vents really quick. Is a puck vent is going to be an inspection access port that's only going to be able to access one stud bay between 2 joists, right? Oftentimes on balconies and catwalks and staircases, if you will, there could be multiple stringers or multiple joists, beams that need to be accessed. And if you just have one little puck vent in there, you're only looking at about roughly maybe 10 to 20% of what needs to be inspected. Additionally, using a borescope could identify staining, but you actually can't prod the area of moisture. What we've seen with some of the borescope inspections is, although it is incredibly useful to see visual anomalies, we're not actually able to determine if that was a new stain, an old stain. Was the plywood left out during the new construction and it got wet and it just never fully dried? So just be a little hesitant if you're getting pitched just a bunch of puck vents or strip vents.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one more point on that is the statute says that you can use an infrared camera or borescopes or whatever the least intrusive method is. But keep in mind that, like Russell said, a borescope is just like a fiber optic camera. You can look around in one section of the balcony between the joists, but you don't know how new that stain is. You want to stick a moisture meter in there to check the current moisture content of the framing member, right? And an infrared camera is technically allowed under the statute, but that tells you if there's a temperature differential in there, which often will tell you whether there's moisture in there because the water may be colder than the air or vice versa. But even if it tells you there's water in there, that doesn't tell you if there's damage in there. There could be no water right now, or the temperature could all be the same in there, so it doesn't show up in the infrared camera, but the joist could be all rotted.
Right.
Or there could be water in there, but no deterioration. And remember, the idea is to check the performance and when we're going to need to go do repairs on this. And you've got to check the status of the deterioration, the moisture content of the wood to be able to do that.
This isn't we're not bashing vents. They do have a purpose. It's just not a one size fit all for every association. So just make sure you're checking in with your team on what the intent is. So we came up with
we do have a question. If the question is, if 95% confidence is achieved by X number of inspections, what happens if, say, one of the inspections shows an issue? Do all the balconies then require inspection? And this is kind of going to be the call of the inspector. There's nothing written in the code that says that if there's a problem, you have to go inspect more. If he thinks, let's say that one that he looked at with the problem had pets using the bathroom on there all the time. So the inspector could say, you know, I see why that one was a problem. They had excessive plants. Yes, he could totally, it's an anomaly, but it's going to be the call of the inspector.
One of the other things that's important to discuss is that oftentimes there is a point in the inspection. Let's say that the plan is to inspect 10 balconies and you know, you do 4 in a row that are life safety issues, systematic failures. A qualified architect or engineer should say, stop, let's put the pause on this contract and let's get in front of the board. Maybe you can still save those monies to begin addressing some sort of life safety issue instead of double dipping it in terms of just to tell you what you already know. That's what I was getting at with the interview question with your contractor of what do you expect? If I go out to a community and I see, you know, grade F, not gonna pass, lots of issues, we don't even go into those meetings talking to them about let's go poke around and see how bad it is. The conversation is much more frank and they will appreciate it. It may hurt a little more, but at least you're not charging them $50,000 just to go say, hey, yeah, just as we thought, it's bad, you know. So the high integrity contractors and the architects need to be upfront with you in the interview process.
Yeah, and getting those repaired up front before the inspection and then having inspector come in while they're open, like we mentioned earlier, can save you money. Mike had a great suggestion about the doing a few and then having an idea of how things are going to go. Yeah,
and just assess. I mean, if they're all really bad, yeah, let's get some shoring up and let's get the repairs going and then do the report. Right. And if we don't know what we're going to find, let's look at a few of them and kind of dip our toe in the water and get an idea first before we commit to the official report. And on that point of what if the inspector wants to look at more, that they absolutely have that integrity. That's totally up to them. So if they want to open up more as they're going, let them. The statute says they're supposed to use their best professional judgment. And if the board says, no, we can't afford that, now the board has the liability for something that you missed. So if the inspector wants to look at more, they're allowed to, and you should let them, and don't take that. If you take their discretion away from them and exercise it yourself, you also bought their liability. So don't do that.
So we came up with a slide here with some common kind of not so straight up questions that aren't necessarily cleanly depicted in the law. So we'll just kind of go through these one by one really quick. The homeowner is responsible for the maintenance in an example property, but the HOA is responsible for the repair. Mike, do you want to touch on that one?
Yeah, that's actually pretty common, where the homeowner is supposed to repaint and stuff, but the structure is HOA's responsibility, and that's definitely this subject to this inspection requirement. It's the structure we're supposed to look at, and so if your governing documents split the responsibility like that, keep in mind if they're never going to give the structure to the homeowner, they're giving the cosmetic aspect to the homeowner, and so it's still subject to the inspection. Another related one we get is, what if we change our CC&Rs and put the whole thing on the homeowner, and now we don't have to do these inspections? And technically that would work, but it's a terrible idea because, I mean, if you've been managing projects for a while and you've seen homeowners do their own projects, just imagine what they're going to do. Half of them, it's going to be, their brother-in-law and a case of beer and a Saturday afternoon, and we bought some 2x4s at Home Depot, and they're going to do a terrible job. So, I mean, these are pretty complicated systems, the structure and the waterproofing and how it integrates with the wall of the building and the sliding glass door and the, you know, where the railings bolt into the, you know, anywhere the railings bolted in is a hole poked in the waterproofing. Getting all that stuff right is fairly complicated. And so you want a sophisticated contractor to do that work, not, you know, some dude and his brother-in-law and a case of beer on a weekend.
One of the things that also comes up with this point is that homeowners most commonly do not know what maintenance means on their deck. It's not defined in the CC&Rs, it's not defined anywhere. And so they don't do the maintenance because they don't understand what needs to be done. They need to wash it off with a hose, sweep it. What does that mean? So to define, and then if they don't maintain it and they don't understand that, then there becomes a repair problem. It's now the HOA's responsibility to pay. So defining what maintenance means, and most manufacturers of the waterproofing will have a maintenance sheet that says, you do this at this year, this at this year, this is, don't put heavy plants on, make sure that things are on stands, and being very specific and putting that in your CC&Rs or providing it how you can to the homeowners. This is your responsibility for maintenance. That then, now if they don't maintain it as it said, now that repair is no longer the HOA's responsibility. It's the homeowner who did not maintain it and caused the damage.
Yeah, and if the association has to go fix it, now you can do a reimbursement assessment because the homeowner violated the rules. Any project built in the last 20 years by a reputable builder is going to have a maintenance manual that the builder provided, and it's going to incorporate the manufacturer's recommendations for maintenance and repair and how often you should recoat the balconies and stuff like that. And that should be incorporated into the reserve study and into the rules. So if it says don't put a rug down over the waterproof membrane on the balconies,
don't ever do that.
Yeah, we're about at our time limit. So
Okay.
This is our last slide. We're going to motor through these last couple questions.
Yeah.
What about Juliet balconies, Mike?
If it's designed for human occupancy and depends on wood framing, then yes. We've got a client where half of them are wrought iron and half of them are wood framed. And if there's a slider or a door that opens onto a wood frame structure with a walking surface, it has to be inspected. If it's just wrought iron or, you know, a glorified pot shelf or it's outside a window, then probably not.
So we did cover the reconstruction and how you can document current repairs to be compliant with your report if your inspector is comfortable with that. What if we have balconies on our clubhouse, Mike?
Residential building with more than three units or more. So if it's a planned unit development, but you got balconies in the amenity clubhouse pool area, not a residential building.
What if we have duplexes? Yeah.
Same thing. That's only 2 units. It has to be 3 or more. So it's still a good idea. If it's, you know, 100 units and it's 50 unit buildings, it wouldn't fall into this requirement, but it's still a good idea to have an accurate reserve study. So you should do something like this, but this law applies to 3 units or more per building.
That's right. What if it is
How about
on the rooftop or
over a garage?
I think, and these are some wobblers, because if it's fully over a garage or just a rooftop deck that's inside the footprint of the roof itself, then probably not. But if any part of it sticks out, then the part that sticks out and all the associated waterproofing systems are subject to inspection. So you see very commonly on newer projects where it's mostly over the garage and maybe a foot of it sticks out, even though the deck's 20 feet deep. Well, if it can fall off while somebody's standing on it, then it has to be inspected. Right?
Life use and extending off the exterior envelope needs to be inspected.
Yep. Yeah.
What about high rises? I hope it's not framed out of wood, but if it is,
it better not be. No, I think wood frame construction can only go up to 5 stories, is it? And above that, it has to be steel and concrete, required to be under the building code because of fire safety issues, right? So it's as simple as this: the fire truck's ladder can't reach a 30-story building, and so you can't build it out of wood. And so this inspection requirement is only for wood frame buildings, so it's necessarily going to be low-rise garden-style condominiums. We do expect some kind of new inspection requirement to come about for high-rises because of the Champlain Towers tragedy in Florida last year. This inspection requirement would not have applied to that building. But this requirement is wood framed only, so that's never going to be a high rise.
And we do have one final question. Since SB 326 was written, have there been any changes? And are there any changes currently in reviews? There haven't been any changes that I'm aware of, and I don't believe there are any in review. But with 721, Mike and I were just discussing this today, there is one change. It used to say that the contractor who did the inspections could not do the repairs, and they took that out. So the contractor who does the inspections can do the repairs. Mike, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, no, that's correct. For the apartment version, the same contractor can do inspections and repairs, and that's a change. For the condominium version, 326, there haven't not been any changes, and there are no changes anticipated. I serve on the Legislative Services Committee for CLAC for 2 different chapters in California, and so we watch coming legislation pretty closely. The deadline to introduce new legislation for this session has passed, and there are no new bills to revise this, and we don't expect any anytime soon.
So straight from the guy who's a part of it. No changes are coming. That's about as good.
Yeah, this is going to be with us in this version for at least a few more years, 2 or 3 more years. We don't expect any changes.
So the last thing I just wanted to let everybody know is that we have a list of everyone who's attended since you had to log on at the webinar. We're going to send out their certificates in a few days. Hopefully we'll have them to you guys by Monday, as well as we're going to have a take-home little sheet that kind of goes over everything we talked about. We'll send you the link to the webinar when that's up and posted and edited. And we'll also have everybody's contact information who spoke. So if you have any additional questions that you think about, feel free to contact any of us or all of us, and we're happy to help you guys out.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Any questions, you can reach out to myself, and I can connect you with either Becky or Michael or Russell.
Thank you.
And have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.